have to do a lot more to defend why being topical is good, while normally the other team is trying to be topical while you're telling them they're not. However, the combination of these two things is not an excuse to be illiterate about the K, because you just said their F should not be in the topic, because framework is best when it's contextual, when you have cards that are about the critical theory that informs the F, when you have cards that, you know, indict the authors that they use that suggest institutional engagement or whatever are preferable. There are generally 3 types of AFs you're going to deal with. The first is the AF that's not going to try to engage the topic at all. Blatantly not going to be T, with the strategy of impact turning framework. Second type of AF is going to be an AF that is germane to the subject. It's going to have some random opinion about education. They are going to say, we are in the direction of the topic. No, they're probably not the federal government increasing regulation or funding, but they have some value statement and have some approach to education policy. Three, they've got a topical plan, they do not defend it. Or they defend parts of it. They say you can read topic DAs, but they will not defend the process of the plan. So you do not get agent counter plans, you do not get the politics DA. Those are not important. It's just important to have a value statement about the resolution that funding or regulation should be increased. You can read topic DAs to those. Or they've got a plan and they don't defend it, and they have an advantage based off the reading of the 1AC and the discursive benefit of that. So keep those in mind when we are discussing different arguments you want to make, because these are 3 different types of AFs. You may not read the same framework shell to all 3 of these, and you certainly do not contextualize arguments the same to all 3 of these, because they're entirely different. For example, what is the point of spending 2 minutes in a 2NC on the interp debate, of telling this team they are not T, when they are blatantly not? What about this team that says they have some approach to the resolution that is in the direction of the topic? You might care a lot about proving the intricacies of why they are topical, because they are suggesting that they are. So the time you allocate to different arguments and how you contextualize any of your net benefits to framework are completely different to these different variations of affirmatives. One and C. What goes here? We're trying to introduce the argument.
You have your violation. Then you usually have your internal import, which is like stasis point for limits and grounds, corporation. You can put your like policy or simulation arguments there, but this could also go on case, I guess.
Same as T. You have an interp and a violation. So you've got definitions of words in the res that you think they do not meet. Then you've got various reasons to prefer the interpretation of defending the topic. And then you've got reasons why it matters. Same composition as topicality, with a little bit more card-heavy focus. What words do you want to define? Okay.
I think depending on the topic, defining a topic-specific one, like an education topic like regulation, and you could just go for T, they decrease regulations.
Anybody else?
USFG.
All of it. You're not looking just to have the same stale interp, no matter what the topic is. Every topic, you're going to have the ability to define resolved as meaning some legislative action, and the U.S. should meaning using the government. Pretty much all those apps are not going to utilize those two things. That literally just sets up the debate, is utilization of the government good or bad? But that debate does not change from topic. So you want to have contextual, topic-specific words defined. You are not looking just to have a debate of government good, bad. You're looking for legal and policy process education over education policy is good. Specific reasons debating this resolution is good. Right? All of your topic education arguments are not just because you want them to use the government. It's because you want them to increase funding and regulation of education policy and to particular groups. These apps might do it broadly based, not just to elementary and secondary schools. Just like you would be searching for any word in the res that you think a team doesn't meet in a normal topicality debate, it's the same here. You're going to put the whole plate out in the 1NC of stuff that you're going to have problems with the AF not being T. So you can pick and choose later how to break down. Just like we talked about yesterday in theory, what are the two terminal impacts, the two impact umbrellas that we'll talk about? Yeah, fairness and education. These are your two net benefits to framework. There are lots of internal links that fit under these two umbrellas, but these are your two impacts. These are what you got. I suggest you introduce a claim for both of these in the 1NC. CX questions of this 1AC. What do you think you should do here? We've just heard an AF that we know is not T and is not seeking to be T. So we are reading framework. How do we approach this cross-X?
You could ask solvency-based questions about the app, like why does this form solve better than this form, or like why can a critical pedagogy solve better than pragmatic action?
Most of the time, if you're seeking to read this, you don't know what the hell's going on. So, remember we talked about this argument is not going to be super successful if you cannot contextualize it to the affirmative. Well, if you don't know what the hell's going on, the things you should be talking about and looking at for the affirmative are what are all of the impacts that the 1AC mentions. What are their harm areas? The AF mentions something like ressentiment or value to life. That matters. You want to have a list of all of these because later in the debate, you're going to want to say one of these two things matters, and it matters more than what the affirmative thinks matters. You're going to have to be making impact calc arguments, so you better know what the impacts to the 1AC are. And secondly, you need to know what the solvency mech of the 1AC is. Is it a genealogy? Is it a pessimistic approach to the world? That all informs what your 1NC shell is going to have, what the case debate is going to be, and what your 2NC block strategy is going to be to deal contextually with the affirmative on framework and how you deal with the responses. You need to know what all the impacts of the affirmative is and clarify what the solvency mech is. The other thing, why you want to know about these, and we'll discuss this more in detail, to set up topical version of the AF arguments. If you don't know what the hell the AF is, how are you going to say, here is an example of an AF that other teams read, or an AF that I think you could read that resolves a lot of what the AF is talking about that can be done in a topical way? When you're explaining that argument, when you're extending it in the 2NC and possibly the 2NR, you're doing it in line with everything they've said is important to the AF and what needs to be done to solve it. So that's when you're setting up arguments in this cross-X, like your contention of maintained segregation and education policy, or how it has affected lower-income communities, seems to be all institutional problems, does it not? It seems to be basis in law. Well, what have we done there? We've just set up the potential rationale for why institutional engagement is good and why there's a possible topical version and there's legal intervention that could remedy some of the harms of the 1AC. But you don't know that unless you know the solvency mech of the 1AC and what its impacts are, because when you're saying topical version, you want it to solve the impacts of the 1AC. You're not just randomly asking, why don't you defend the topic? These are leading questions that set up for stuff you know you're going to say in the 1NC on the case debate, as well as your broader strategy on framework. Cards? Yeah or no? For TVA, sure, but just broadly, framework 1 and C. Yeah, that's the slight difference with T is it's a little bit more card heavy here, that you want contextual theoretical responses to what you think the 1AC is going to say. So if you know the 1AC has a pessimistic approach to the world, your case debate may have a lot of optimism, good arguments, and your framework arguments would want to reflect that. And that'll all make a little bit more sense when we discuss things in a little bit. Just like we talked about yesterday when we are extending theory, top of the 2NC, 1NR, wherever this is being extended, impact overview. Fairness outweighs and turns the case. Education or decision-making, whatever you want to call it, outweighs and turns the case. And so the 2AC, a common approach in these debates is the 2AC to either analytically make a lot of arguments or have some light cards that they call DAs, and for there to be like 16 of them. See through the BS. These have been attached to buzzwords. There are about 5 args you can make on framework. There are not 15. They get redundant at a certain point, and you need to group arguments. Each of these DAs, despite it being called a new fancy word, is probably based in ARG number 3 when you get to ARG number 12. You need to kind of realize these are all ultimately indicts of role-playing, or these are all ultimately indicts of the state, or these are all ultimately exclusion arguments, and kind of group those and deal with them there. Don't fall for the trap of, there being like 16 DAs, and then the one air gets to come up and it's like, you dropped the sarcophagus DA, or whatever the hell, insert, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Pay attention to the 2AC case overview. The 2AC, in 99% of these debates, is going to have anywhere between a minute to who the hell knows long overview on case that is pre-written. This is going to outline all the impacts to the 1AC they want to isolate that may have not been super clear, and especially if you didn't ask about them in the 1AC cross-X. This is going to outline what their solvency mech is, and it's going to have just a broad indict, probably, and there are going to be slight implicit indicts of T there. Why is this important? Because you're making an impact overview at the top of framework, and if you are not clashing with the impacts to the AF, it's going to be very difficult to win that debate. If you're saying topical version of the AF, and you don't say, when the AF says, here are the 3 ways that we think we solve this X problem, and you don't say, this topical version deals with number 1, 2, and 3 in this way, you're not going to win that argument. It's very important to deal with that 2AC case page, because that's going to have in itself a lot of implicit responses to framework, and it's going to force you to contextualize your 2NC on T, because you're dealing directly with their verbiage. And that's the next most important thing I would write down. use the verbiage of the affirmative. The buzzwords they are using, the terminology that they are using, if you're not also using that terminology, we turn this X thing that the AF describes as an issue. You're going to look like you're generically reading blocks that could be read in any debate. You make it more contextual when you use the terminology that the AF is using. Not too much to say here. Just like any 2&R, basically. Pick. You're probably not both going to win your core fairness net benefit and your core education net benefit. The AF is probably doing strong in some way. Just like we talked about yesterday with even if statements. Pick and choose where you think your strongest internal link to your strongest net benefit is. You think you win a large impact that can somehow deal with the case. Because in all likelihood, you might have parts of the case debate, since it does get very meddled and they dovetail with each other in the 2&R as well. So you're not going to have time to win both of those net benefits. And you still got to play D to all the stuff that AF is talking about in the 1AR. 2&R is going to be very hard if you do not have a depth of block explanation. If your entire block is reading a bunch of new framework cards that support initial claims you made, like cards that say fairness is important, blah, 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 those are not helpful. What is helpful is contextualization. What is helpful is case lists that you think the affirmative justifies in your fairness argument for limits and ground. What is helpful is specific breaking down of the topical version in relation to the 1AC solvency mechanisms. What is helpful is impact calc based off what the 1AC talks about. What is helpful is actually engaging the case. These debates are constantly lost and seem horrible because the framework debater looks illiterate on the K. When this actually forwards many different philosophical and communication theories. You seem, and this is a lot easier because then you can have a 2&R because you're bracketed with time and you have to deal, even if you're not extending parts of the case, you still have to deal with the case debate because that's where they're saying the AF outweighs everything. Is you're allowed to say, don't make me reinvent the wheel. I showed you 7 cases that are super horrible that they justify in the 2NC. I'm not going to repeat all 7 of them here. You know what they are. That gives you the time to have more packaged and neat arguments. Can't do that if the judge had no clue what the hell you were talking about on case list in the 2NC. And then just like every 2&R, capitalize on 2-AR mistakes, or 1AR mistakes rather. If the 1AR is super light on fairness, maybe that's the argument you go for, right? If the 1AR is super light in places, that should determine the 2&R strategy. All right, now we're starting with parts of the debate. Interp debate. We kind of talked about this on what definitions we want to read. What about on topicality? What are the 2 sort of lenses through which you can view interps?
Competing interpretations or reasonability.
Yeah, still important here. For example, the latter 2 AFs, the AF that says they are in the direction of the topic, they say something about education, and then the AF that takes a stance on education but maybe doesn't give you process-based ground, both of those are going to say they're reasonably topical. So you still want to establish some competing interps frame when you're doing the interps debate in the 2NC, because you never want T to be probabilistic. Oh, the AF's like sort of T, they say something about education. That should never be enough for you, because you are saying through the definitions that you've read, you are creating a superior version of debate than whatever their counter-interp is. And if there is a comparison between yours and their interp, you want competing interpretations to be the frame that is established. So you want a competing interp's good argument there. And then obviously, extend terms in the 2NC. You kind of talked about this a little bit is you have some flexibility here. I personally don't find it super strategic, but some people do, where you can pick and choose interps that you extend to the 2NC. So, for example, you could only extend the education-relevant terms. So you want the AF to be a statement on education policy. That's going to be good enough for you because you've got DAs about education, and then you can have the net benefit of education literacy good. But you don't extend USFG and should. So you omit all of their state bad offense. I don't find that super strategic because it doesn't make a lot of sense to me because that education literacy is devil in the details about government policy making. But there is some flexibility with what interps you extend to avoid some offense. So you could just be like, we want to have a discussion about education. You don't have to be the government. It could just be your personal opinion about education, but it needs to be about education. And that could solve some 2AC offense.
I have a question about that. If you were to do that, so let's say hypothetically you did only go for like the education-specific interp. If you did do that, and to avoid the like state bad stuff, if you had like policy simulations, good argument, and it's not the state, would that be sufficient to be able to solve their state dissats and why they should read a plan?
Potentially. I mean, I'm going to talk about this a little bit later because I don't think state good is a response to, or state bad is a response to framework, and I don't think you should have to defend the state as a good institution. You're defending education over that subject is good, but we'll talk about that more in a second. Deal with the counterinterps. We've kind of already approached this. What's the AF that is germane? And I stated this earlier, but you may not remember. And the AF that, reads a plan maybe but doesn't defend it. What is their counterinterp maybe going to be? Yes. We are in the direction of the topic, and that's all we need to be. What would our logical response to that be?
Does it set a bright line on the topic?
Yeah, what is germane? A lot of people have opinions. A lot of people and a lot of articles have the word education in them, right? The topic isn't education. The topic is to increase funding and regulation for secondary and elementary schools. Right? That's a very specific point of controversy that people rationally disagree there should be more funding. People rationally disagree that there should be regulation. They think it should be an incentives-based approach. It's not just education good or not. And that's kind of the topic that they are approaching, that type of vague statement. So your core fairness DA, i.e. your limits and grounded turnaling, still completely apply to that counterinterp. You have to reapply your net benefits to the counterinterp. Right? Because in the 1NC, you are just approaching it as though they don't meet those words, and then it's good to be fair, it's good to have some education over education. Well, then they say they provide that to some level. So you have to recontextualize fairness, recontextualize the lack of education to that. Because maybe the education you think is important is process education. It's the details of how the government funds education. And that's something, that latter AF that reads a plan but lets you read education DAs but won't let you defend the process over, i.e. agent counterplans, process counterplans, the politics DA. All that's super important to education is something you would have to reapply there. Fairness, germaneness is so vague that it still explodes limits. It still is difficult for net ground. It's something you would have to reapply to that counterinterp. Now let's talk about silly definitions. USFG equals people. It equals individual. The two debaters are individuals, so they are the USFG. What's our logical response to that?
You two folks are definitely not the federal government.
Yeah, no. Yeah, the government. No more time spent there. That's resolved equals to reduce by mental analysis. That's the common K people resolve term. Why may that not be so great for either our fairness or education net benefit? I.e., we have forwarded in the 1NC that resolved means to do legislative action.
Probably explores like the limits of like what counts as like mental analysis, because like you said, lots of people have like different ways to like view education.
Yeah, this is meaningless. The point I'm trying to establish here is do not let the AF get away with this BS. Right? They are going, in some of these, especially the second and third tier of affirmative, try to counter-define a lot of words to bog you down in the interp debate. These should not be something you have to spend a lot of time on, like, come on. But if you blow these off, you don't reapply your net benefits and say why this doesn't solve your net benefits, because that's what a counterinterp is. It's saying it solves your fairness claim. It's not super unfair. It solves your education claim. If you drop these, the debate is very difficult to win because the point of these is to solve your offense. So you just need to make sure you point out how silly that those actually are. And the last thing they're going to kind of say, our words are indeterminate. There's some style of these apps that are going to be like, having such fixed and boxed in interpretations of what these words mean are bad. What do we say if they're just like, it's difficult to understand what these words actually mean, words are indeterminate?
Probably just make an argument that's like, regardless of whether they're determined or not, reading definitions and like having debates about competing interpretations is still the best way to be able to resolve debates about the topic.
For sure. Yeah, you definitely, one, grammar matters. You've read definitions of all of these things. These aren't random. Having a debate over these are good. If it is difficult to determine what these are, then why not establish a limit on them? And debating about these is valuably good. Think about legally. Think about in the court system. Does the definition of words matter for things? Yes, vastly. For interpretation of statute at the government level, it is legally important to know and establish what the definitions of words means. Another thing that you're going to see, and I presume some of y'all have come across this term before, is the role of the ballot. Has anybody heard that before? Know what that means?
Like the way the judge should like evaluate the round.
Yeah. The AF is going to say something conveniently about what the AF already talked about and say the role of the ballot is to do something about that. Why may that not be so great?
Arbitrary.
Yeah. It's arbitrary and self-serving. The AF had a position that capitalism is bad. Thus, the role of the ballot is the team who best breaks down the system of capitalism. I wonder why. What is the role of the ballot that we have forwarded in the 1 in C with our interp? Yeah, to answer the resolutional question, that's the role of the ballot. And then the other thing a lot of people will say here is instead of some arbitrary system, it should just be determined by who did the better debating. And then obviously, we forwarded an interp of what we think debates should be about in the 1 in C. One last thing on the interp debate, you may not see this totally often, bringing over something from counterplans, a permutation. This is generally coupled with a sequencing argument. So they will say, policymaking, we don't have an objection with as a whole. We have objection with how it currently is. Policymaking is currently sexist or racist, for example, in its current makeup. So it's not that institutions are inherently bad. It's just that the way they are currently structured and organized is not good. So they will say, once we resolve the ism of the AF, for example, then institutions can be okay. So sequencing, AF first. So permutation, legal action can all be great, but once we've resolved what the AF talks about, what might you say to that?
Probably, I mean, this would be more of a question like in class X, but like, when does policymaking not suck under like that interpretation? Like, when is it not ever going to like meet somebody's want?
I would have two responses to this. First, T was introduced as a reason, or the AF is theoretically illegitimate. What does the permutation include? The AF. Okay, nice. All of our DAs to the AF being the way it was apply. Second, seems to prove topical version of the AF to me, doesn't it? Oh, institutions can work after we resolve something about the AF? That was the whole point of TVA, was to do the AF likely through an institutional or legal dynamic. First net benefit, fairness. What are the two common internal links? You see these in topicality debates, they're in your standards, your reasons to prefer. Yeah. Can someone give me an example of the sort of generic limits claim to AFs that are not resolutional? What would our sort of...
You get K's of method, Baudrillard, Wolverson, like they list like a bunch of
Yeah, there are an infinite number of ways to sort of non-topically approach, or philosophically approach, methodologically approach this area that are not the USFG increasing funding or regulation. Why is that bad if the topic is less limited? What's the impact? Who cares?
Oh, well, the impact for like limits would be like the caseless argument, like you just explode the amount of prep that we have, research burden.
Yep, all of that. It impacts preparation, because we all have the topic. You just post facto said it sucks, and then told us we should have a different debate, which affects preparation and research, and it also affects the quality of response. Why is the quality of response better to topical affirmatives? Because you knew it was going to be there, so before the tournament, you cut DAs, counterplans, case debates, whatever. You're prepared to engage in that debate, and thus the quality of response is better. And then preparation and research are implicated in an unlimited topic. What about ground? How's negative ground been deprived or reduced? Such as generics like what?
Like the state's counterplan into federalism.
Okay. So stuff relevant to the education topic. Okay, so can't read our generic counterplans and DAs. The whole point here, and we discussed this a little bit earlier, is this particular statement was given as the resolution because it's a balanced controversy. There are some people who think this is a bad idea. There are some people who write about why it's a good idea. Balance is good because you have to be at the other 50%, and then you have to be neg. Anything else allows the affirmative to potentially claim truisms. Like X ideology is bad. X-ism is bad. You should be forced to respond to the affirmative making an attempt at solving one of those things, and then you can counterplan out of their mechanism. Then you can say, sure, that thing is bad, but the affirmative doesn't actually solve it. Or that approach is actually disadvantageous because it makes it worse. You can't do that if there's no direct statement of, action of that particular resolutional statement. So it allows the app to take the moral high ground and potentially claim a truism, which makes responding to it very difficult. And plus, for K's, the AF is always already the permutation. You read CAP, the AF is going to say somewhere in that 1AC that they thought capitalism was bad. You just didn't get it. Or you just didn't see it. So the AF is always already built in a permutation against the K, which is your other logical response to this. And that's the ground that they are going to say that they give you. We talked about this a little bit yesterday. Why does fairness matter? Just like not in like normal T debates, these teams are likely going to question the importance of fairness to debate. Some may say unpredictability is good. Some may say this fairness contract is exclusive and not neutral. So we actually have to defend the impact and import of fairness. So in this 2 and C, when we're saying fairness outweighs and turns the case, what are we saying there?
Debate's a game.
Yes, 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 yes. First thing we got to say. We got to frame it. We got to give it context. Why does it matter? Debate is a game. Why is it a game?
Because as winners and losers, as things like speaker points, and it's like an activity designed for those things to exist.
Exactly. There are certain rule constructs, a win-loss system. That means it's a game. Why does that matter for fairness being an impact?
Because we destroy the game and we don't have like a stasis point to play the game. It's always going to skew one side or the other, and it becomes an unfair game.
Exactly. There are two general arguments that are brought here. First, it's a prerequisite. How can you have a debate if you have not agreed about what the rules of the game are? So it is a prior question. Why does a prior question matter? Because when the 2AC extends their case overview and says the AF outweighs the T-arg, you say this is a procedural argument. It gets evaluated prior to the impact of the case. And second, it turns the case. This is where an argument called truth testing sets in. I'm going to write down truth testing. This suggests this is about the quality of response here. We want to be able to test the validity of the AF. It means we want to have a case debate. We want to have coherent responses that are well researched prior. An AF that changes the balance of preps post facto and is not resolutional diminishes the quality of response, which means we are not a well-prepared opponent. It means we cannot effectively interrogate the case. So we don't know if what the AF is saying is valid or true, because it can't be effectively tested. Which means that you should not evaluate the impact of the AF prior to T, because T should be a prior question because it actually leads us to test the case. There are two common responses to this net benefit. The world is structurally unfair. For X group of people, the system institutionally disenfranchises groups, etc. So unfairness isn't, inevitable and it's something impossible to achieve and it's not neutral. What would we say to this? Anybody?
I was yawning.
Go for it.
That just because the world is unfair doesn't mean we should make more things unfair. And that, just because some people have, bad stuff happen to them doesn't mean that adding to that problem resolves it.
Anybody else?
I guess if the world's unfair, that's probably where you could cross-apply any of your sort of offense about why state or institutions is probably good to sort of resolve those things.
Does this have anything to do outside of debate? Does this argument?
Yeah.
Why is debate different? Because you would say this argument is out of context, right? This doesn't really apply. The competitive element of debate is that it is goal-oriented. What is the goal? To have a discussion about education. Well, that is inherently exclusive of a lot of things, is it not? That particular discussion. So a modicum of fairness is important because the game is goal-oriented. Where it's a very specific discussion. And also, the AF doesn't necessarily reject all constructs of fairness, do they? Time limits, prep. We're still abided by. The second strain of argument is exclusion. Your T interpretation, that specific discussion, actively excludes what the AF wants to talk about. And the case debate proved why that was important and impacted that out. What would our responses to that be?
EA can solve for certain portion of the offense.
Now, granted, this is conditional, right? This assumes this banks this argument on winning the TVA, which may not occur and may not exist in the first place. Because remember, there's a whole strand of apps that don't even attempt to be within the topic, right? So, and have maybe potentially a very pessimistic approach that the TVA may be rather difficult. But yes, definitely, if you can win this, then it proves there's no exclusion of discussion. But let's assume we don't. What other things can we possibly say? There is a distinction between argumentative and ontological exclusion. You are just saying that there should be a goal-oriented, subject-focused discussion. So argumentative. Obviously, certain arguments are not going to fit within that. Not an exclusion of groups of people. This is not a referendum on any one person's beliefs or value system. It just says there should be argumentative exclusion, not ontological. Also, they view exclusion as unitary. Who gets excluded in their world? The neg. If the AF can just present any case that it desires, then the benefits of prep, research, in-depth thinking, quality of response are all diminished in the world of the neg. Education. Second amendment. What are some things that are often discussed in this umbrella? What are some of the internal links? We talked about limits and ground for fairness. I'm just going to broadly say skills. We talked about this yesterday in the realm of portable skills. This is generally under the bracket of decision-making skills, which includes critical thinking, whatever. You mentioned a word earlier about having a focused discussion. It starts with stasis. Anything else? What about, does anybody know what the concept referred to of debating AF and neg half the time? One more important thing. It's policy education. Decision-making skills. So the same thing we did with fairness. We're in our 2 and C. We're given impact overview. We're saying decision-making impact outweighs and turns the case. What might we be saying there? Anybody have any thoughts? Okay, you said a couple things there. So the first thing is portability. These are skills, whether they be critical thinking, knowledge over particular subject areas like legal literacy or empathetic learning that is developed from switch side debate, are all translatable skills. After all, the purpose of debate is not to find the truth. It is just to find the most rigorous argument, and that's what wins debates, not the thing that is actually true, as I'm sure some of you can attest to stupid things you've won on or have lost to. B is magnitude. There are cards floating around. I do not find this super persuasive, and I don't think most people either, that are like impact cards that say, you know, if we as democratic thinkers had decision-making skills, we'd be able to solve a myriad of problems like wars and economic decline and etc. Not super persuasive, but it's something to be aware of that exists. And C, it turns the case. Advocates are probably strongest with all of these endowed skills, whether it be literacy, of the institutional system to learn how to best tear it down, whether being able to understand how to agree with and rationally disagree with your opponents, have goal-oriented focus over a particular subject area, can all improve potentially addressing the affirmative's harm. Stasis, what is it?
It needs to be like a point of like equitability on like what to argue on.
Right. It is we were talking about this earlier, between an AF that just makes a value statement or an approach to education that is germane versus an AF that very specifically has the federal government either give funding or regulation to very specific groups in the school system. That's a very specific question. This is not a topic, again, of education good, bad. That's a very general and vague statement that does not allow for certainly effective decision-making. It is better to have a year-long debate over a focused and very specific question, i.e. stasis. This res doesn't change and alter all the time, and it's a very specific question. What about political process education? Why would we care about that? Why is that a good thing? What's our impact to that?
Sometimes when I read framework, I read like these institutional infiltration arguments against these race teams, so that like so the top version you have would like be able to solve, because when you sort of infiltrate these sort of large hegemonic groups, that's the only way to like break them down, which is like from the inside.
Yeah, there's certainly an argument that says whether the state's good or bad, you probably should know who runs the Department of Education. If you think education policy is so screwed right now in the status quo, if you're not aware of the inner workings of the federal government and how funding gets allocated, whether it be local, state, or federal government, it doesn't really matter all that much. That type of literacy over that subject area is important to address or remedy anything the AF talks about, so potentially solve or turn the case. This is why I wanted to say earlier, you do not have to say the state is good for framework. If they say the state is bad, that is not a response, necessarily. Why? Because you're not saying the state is an inherently effective actor. You could say that on the case debate if it disagrees with the affirmative. You are just saying the state could be the worst thing in the world. But we should learn that through a year of debating, not coming in to start the topic, assuming that's the question, and never changing, i.e. defending the same pessimistic approach on the AF and neg. That should be learned, what is effective, based off debates. Policy literacy is good. Policy education is good. Not the policies themselves are actually effective, but if we want to alter them, we have to know. So when someone says the state is bad, not necessarily a response, because we're not necessarily saying the state is good. Could say that on the case, but you don't want to muddy those two things, because this is a distinct argument. Switch side debate. What is it? Why is it good?
Debaters get to know both sides of an issue and topic, so they see like all areas of education.
Anybody else? A lot of that, and that is true, is that it leads to resolving problems like echo chamber, dogmatism, groupthink. Because it exposes you to different viewpoints, and it leads to empathetic learning. You learn how to deal with people that disagree with you. For example, don't ask, don't tell. Does anybody know what that policy was in the military?
I think it was like, unless someone like forces you to like divulge some information, like don't like go reporting stuff.
Mm-hmm. About your sexual identity and preference. Well, that was successful with conservatives, not because it was like, come on, you're going to be a better person if you do this. No, they weren't exactly compelled by that argument. They were compelled by this would improve military readiness. You learn how to pitch arguments effectively to alternative viewpoints rather than just being like, you suck as a person, change. It's probably not going to change the system a lot now, is it? But if you learn what they actually care about and how to package arguments for them, that can actually possibly improve the likelihood of effectiveness. That can alter potential co-optation. Talk about our answers to the first common response to this. We should not have to defend the USFG. The USFG sucks. The USFG is an oppressor, potentially.
The point isn't to defend the USFG, but instead, like, I guess, like, negative state action.
We talked about it here. We just had this discussion about using the state.
You don't defend the state.
No one said you should. We just said we should learn that question, not axiomatically. We should not just assume we know the answer to that question. It should be done through a year of debating it out. And secondly, at no point does this require role-playing. At no point does this require you to pretend you are the USFG. We all recognize that we're 4 students sitting in a room, reading research, and forming our own opinions about subject areas. That's all we think is happening. This is all why education is good. Not pretending we're actually policymakers or we're actually Congress implementing this policy. So role-playing is not required. There's no link to that argument. Topical version of the app. What should we do here when introducing this argument? When should we introduce it? The 2 NC, the 1 NC? 1 NC. Don't come up with these haphazardly. Know before the debate, based off disclosure or however else you're informed about what the affirmative is, what your idea for an example of an affirmative that would resolve it. How can you potentially come up with some examples? Where might you see examples of other apps?
You could like look at self-love apps on the topic of people
Yeah.
in the resolution.
Give examples of stuff other teams are reading. Now, it's not going to happen at the first tournament, but once you start getting some tournaments under your belt and people start posting these on the internet, use examples. Blah blah blah's app does this, which is like an institutional approach to resolving your problem. And what can you also get from that? You can get solvency cards that say this is actually an effective approach to be done institutionally. Should you read cards when you do topical version? Do you think you should? I mean, you said that the potential, is it better?
Yeah, probably.
Yes, definitely. Read cards. Why? Remember that whole 2AC case overview where they're going to talk about their solvency mechanism that is obviously not the topical version, where they're going to say all the impacts to the affirmative? Well, what's going to help you is when the judge can read some cards after the debate that says an institutional approach or whatever actually remedies this harm of the affirmative. Because you're probably not going to come out with this out of thin air, right? There's going to be literature that suggests this should be done. So you want to have those cards. I would have one solvency card that already speaks. You don't want an FYI card that's just like, this could be done through the government. It's a card that is written from a scholarly critical approach that suggests in some capacity it solves the harm of the affirmative. Or it suggests that it is a preferential solvency mechanism to go through institutional dynamics than not. This isn't a generic law good card. This is a card specifically about the author, the solvency mechanism of the affirmative, the impact that it addresses, etc. Is this like a counterplan? Yes and no. There are times where you might like it to be, times where you may not. Obviously, you're potentially advocating that the USFG could do this and it would solve the app. and you can think about it through the lens of counterplan solvency when you're trying to describe how this solves the AF harms. But what can AF say to counterplans? Could. What else?
That's negative ground. So, or if you wanted to have a policy discussion, then your counterplan's right there. You should have read that.
Do you know? Have you all learned the SPOT acronym for dealing with counterplans?
Spot.
Perm, theory, offense. They can have solvency deficits. Should your T version have to solve the AF? No. That's not the point of the argument. That's why it can potentially be damaging if you package it as a counterplan. The topical version just proves there is a route within the topic that you can have a similar, if not damn close, discussion to what the AF is having, so it is not exclusionary. But when they start coming up and you say T version and they're like, this T version sucks, it doesn't solve our AF perfectly. That's the damn point. If you read this AF, we should have a case neg to it. When they say T version doesn't solve, you say, yeah, you're correct. The topical version is imperfect. That's what we call neg ground. So there are costs and benefits to packaging it as a counterplan. And that's just kind of a strategic choice in part. Execution tips. First, we already sort of talked about this. Group. There are not 15 responses to framework, no matter if they exist. There are probably like a total of 5, and they all fit within similar themes. So you don't want to have to keep repeating yourself over and over again that we don't cause role playing, for example. Right? You want to make that distinction over debating the state versus using the state once very clearly, and that just really clarifies the debate from there, because if the whole 1AR is state bad, and your 2NC was very clear 30 to 45 seconds or whatever, like, look, this does not apply, X reason.
So, do you
That is
think reading like the Esberg and Sagan card is just like simulation's good, and you just defend simulation
No.
but not role playing?
No. There's no the simulation stuff. If the AF is explicitly says that is a horrible thing in the 1AC, you can have that as a response. But that's not totally necessary either. You're just saying, like, learning about this as students is good, not pretending we're Congress. So you don't necessarily have to have that sort of simulation. Now, there are certain types of critiques that is very responsive to, that is, it is helpful, in other cases where it's irrelevant. So there's a difference between, like, Virilio versus identity-style teams. The identity-style debate's not super relevant. In the aforementioned, a bit more relevant. And this dovetails with, they're going to call everything a DA. Everything the 2AC is a DA with some weird word. Make sure you bracket these, group them accordingly, and see through that. You do not have to have, a card when they have 15 analytical DAs. Another thing I kind of want to talk about is kicking out. You don't have to kick out a T. But let's say our 1NC included T in the cap K. We decided through strategic value, whatever, we wanted to go for cap. Is there anything they could potentially do to us with framework if we just didn't talk about it?
If you don't answer the offense on the flow, then they can extend it.
Yeah. There is stuff in there that they're just like, it's terrible what you did to us in this debate. Your focus and advocacy for an exclusive discussion was bad, and maybe it's psychic violence. That was something that happened in the debate, which means they could use that as an impact if you do not kick out of it. Also, same thing the other way around. You want to go for T. You assume T becomes before everything, and you don't kick out a cap. But they had a permutation, and now they solve like an extinction level impact maybe. And maybe you're going through your deliberation solves extinction stuff. And if cap is bad, maybe it has a weird interaction with all the government good stuff. So, let's do the second scenario first. We're getting rid of another off-case position that is not T. We want to kick out of that properly. We want to continue to establish T is a prior question. It is a procedural that should come before everything else, even if they were to link turn the cap K. It should be irrelevant. Same thing for T. We want to clarify, hey, we are getting rid of this position. We're no longer advocating for X, so whatever their problems with it were are now gone. And whatever K or whatever else we're going for, it outweighs. You want to say even if they win an exclusion DA from framework, capitalism's got a bigger impact, capitalism excludes everyone, etc. You want to make sure you're not getting trapped in, you kick out of another position that doesn't screw you on T, and you don't allow stuff they say on T to hurt you on another position. Know your judge. This is potentially a very polarizing argument. Also, judges have particular opinions about whether they're persuaded by procedural fairness or whether they'd have a more substantive engagement with the AF about education, over-education is important, and the devil's in the details, versus the AF's vague value statement. So make sure you're familiar, because judges have opinions about framework as a whole and what types of arguments they like, so it'll kind of emphasize whether you go. Context, answer the AF. I'm going to keep repeating this because it's the biggest problem, is you read generic cards, same shell every debate, the debate doesn't change, and you just assume fairness is going to come first. You're likely to lose that debate, or it's just an uphill battle, rather than having contextual responses. You have a limit DA that lists cases based off that specific case. You have DAs applied to that specific counterinterp. You have specific education, literacy solves the harm of the act. You have specific impact defense. Read impact defense. Write that down. Read impact defense, what you've learned the 1AC is. How are you going to say fairness comes first, or decision-making comes first, if you don't have defense to their original impact? Yeah, it's good to say your impact outweighs. It's even better to say your impact outweighs and their impact isn't so big, or they don't solve all of it. And I'll just have this here one more time. I'm not going to write it down since we already had this discussion. You do not have to defend the state good. Right? It is not a necessary burden. It is a distinction you can make, but it's also something you can willingly defend. And we talked about this before. You can mix around interps. If you know that their core response, and pretty much all of it to T, is going to be the state sucks, you could just have a T argument that focuses around discussions of education good. It does not necessarily have to involve a particular actor. What am I supposed to go to?
What, 40, I'd say. So.
I have one more thing I could discuss shortly, but I think I'd rather just open it up to random questions if you have any. If not, I could. Nobody has any questions about anything? I simply don't believe that, but we also have a short amount of time.
What are the best responses to these sort of framework arguments that you've heard? Or the most strategic ones?
From the perspective of the AF,
Yeah.
you're going to have a lecture on that.
Okay.
I'm not going to answer framework in 3 minutes. I'm going to do this real short. You all can read more about it if you want. Deliberation versus agonism. These are two general political theories that will stem from framework. Deliberative democracy is the phrase you will see. These will be contextual cards you want in your 1NC shell. Will prioritize that legitimacy is gained through rational opinion formation through a process initiated in the public sphere. It is an exchange of arguments that is done rationally, civilly, that tries to result in some neutral consensus. Right? It tries to reach an end. It says we should come to a decision about whether we should increase funding or regulation towards education. The critique of this is that it presumes neutrality, that is an even playing field. Just like we talked about outside of the neutrality critique of fairness, it's the same thing. The agonistic people say this is exclusive, and generally, it's got a problem with saying the discussion should be rational and civil, i.e. it should not involve emotions. It can only be nonviolent and peaceful, which is, if any of you have interacted with any critique affirmatives, they take differing opinions on those. Agonism, however, is a political theory that emphasizes the positive aspects of some forms of political conflict. It says disagreement's going to happen. Maybe we shouldn't have to come to some sort of consensus. Exclusion is, to some degree, a part of politics, but we should try to minimize that to the best extent that we can. This is generally agonism as opposed to antagonism. Violently disagreeing with someone versus respectfully understanding that there is disagreement and conflict, and that we should try, and work through that. And that disagreement and conflict is potentially a good thing. These are things you should read more into, and things that you're going to see cards about in every 1NC on framework. These are political and communication theories that are going to directly disagree with parts of the critique affirmatives that you see. I'm not advocating for either one of these in particular. They disagree with each other. They're advocates for both of them. It's kind of just your choice through reading what you think is more strategic, and kind of depends on the affirmative at times. But these are the sort of grounding theories. And this is the last thing I want to say that I didn't mention, where your evidence comes from. This is about an argument about the rules of debate. So guess who writes about these things sometimes? Debate people. Not a super big fan of that. Maybe in a pessimistic identity debate is not the greatest thing to have some 26-year-old white debate coach who wrote a research paper or wrote an academic thesis about why they think switch-side debate is good, to tell that team. Maybe it's better to actually come from scholarly works in the communication and political theory field that suggest this is good. Because there are debate articles that say stasis is good. There are debate articles that say switch-side debate is good. There are debate articles that have definitions of the USFG and resolve and stuff like that. And that's just kind of a choice you want to make, and can sometimes get you into trouble if your whole 1NC and whole strategy is just a bunch of older debate coaches and articles that say this version of debate is good. Rather, here's an academic literature that supports all of our net benefit claims. And that is the end.